So hello there guys, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast. I hope that you guys are doing well and staying safe as always. Big news coming from the FIA, the news that we were all waiting to hear, and that is confirmation of the teams which complied with the budget cap and received their certificates of compliance. Oh, so how treasured they will be for those lucky teams, and the few teams that did not comply with the 2021 budget cap, and of course the different types of breaches that they committed. We can confirm that in total 7 teams complied fully with the budget cap. No procedural breaches, no cost cap breaches or anything like that. We were aware of Williams earlier, a procedural breach that Williams committed of the budget cap back in April, which was owing to a late submission of documents and paperwork, which they received a $25,000 fine for. That was something we knew long in advance. And then of course the 2 teams which were rumoured to have committed breaches for the budget cap, that was Aston Martin and Red Bull. The former Aston Martin only committing a procedural breach, the details of which we do not know at this point, and Red Bull the only team to have not met the budget cap and spent too much money, the amount of which we do not know, although we believe it's around the region of $1 to $2 million at this point in time. But they are the team that are going to be coming under real scrutiny in the coming days and weeks as to what a fitting punishment for them will be. Joining me in this episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast for this budget cap special discussion is Courtney Pine and Lee Wallington, the DNF1 panel in full flow this evening. First of all, Courtney, how are you doing? I know you've been shaking off a little bit of man flu, but are you feeling okay? Are you ready for this big budget cap discussion? It's going to be a real doozy of an episode, if I do say so myself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm still shaking it off. As you could probably tell in the last episode, I was very much in battle with my illness. I'm getting there slowly but surely. I've got my hot lemon drink here with a DNF1 mug, of course, bit of product placement right there.
Hey.
But yeah, I've got my hot lemon drink, but don't worry, Adam, I'm not going to add that to our catering budget for the year.
Yeah, I mean, as an accountant myself, I'm sure there can be some interesting cost treatments if you sort of dive deep enough, although I wouldn't want to imply any malpractice or wrongdoing, especially in a finance workplace at all. Certainly wouldn't want to do that. Ethics and all of that, you've got to remember to uphold those to the best of your ability. But nice bit of product placement there, Courtney, for those of you watching on YouTube. Of course, the old DNF1 podcast logo when we started out a few years ago certainly brings back memories. Of course, we've changed the branding and the logo to something a bit more modern, a bit more dynamic since then, but it's always nice to see that we still have some of those cups lying around. I really got to get myself another one of those, because I think I gave one of those.
Go for it.
I gave one of those as a Christmas present to someone, and just something they like, mugs, and I thought, yeah, why not give them one with the DNF1 logo on it? But now I kind of miss my old one, so I might have to get myself another one. Lee, of course, how are you doing? Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I was obviously do apologise to all the viewers and listeners that I missed the Japanese Grand Prix, which is why I wasn't able to provide the commentary on the last one. Being I didn't wake up and then I didn't have a chance to watch it. So a bit gutted I couldn't join you, because that sounded like a smashing session you had last time. I'll say session, that's the wrong word. Session, smashing podcast the last time. So I'm looking forward to contributing on this one, and we get stuck into nitty-gritty bits.
The old nitty-gritty.
Yeah, the old nitty-gritty. We absolutely love it. And of course, what better nitty-gritty subject than the one with the 2021 budget cap? And of course, there's been so much discussion on this from so many different people, not just us, obviously people in F1, mainstream media, everybody asking the question, when were the budget cap findings going to be released out to the public? There was a delay from what was meant to happen last week when they were meant to be unveiled. I think it was last Wednesday. That got delayed conveniently until after the World Championship was won. Not trying to draw conclusions between the two or imply some interesting timing there from the FIA, but it was quite convenient for that to be brushed under the rug whilst the World Championship was being decided, which it was. Max Verstappen fully deserving the 2022 World Championship, being the class of the field. And of course now we have to raise the question as to what is going to be happening with stuff like World Championships. Will Max Verstappen and Red Bull be keeping the titles that they have won for 2022? Will Max be keeping his title for 2021? All big questions that are going to be answered in due course. But first thing I wanted to talk to you guys about and sort of bring up was the budget cap announcement itself. We obviously got news about the 7 teams that complied with the budget cap, which was basically everyone with the exception of Williams, Aston Martin and Red Bull. We already knew of Williams' punishment. We heard rumours about Aston Martin's procedural breach and Red Bull's budget cap breach, which did come to life. So it seems that those rumours were actually on the money from what we saw in Singapore. It wasn't defamation, as Christian Horner and Dr. Helmut Marko were basically exclaiming about throughout that weekend. Of course, it would have been very uncomfortable for them both to hear about that before any actual findings had come out. And of course, there was a lot of he said this, or he said that, or she said this and she said that, and a lot of accusations being thrown left, right and centre. But we got the confirmation from the FIA, and I suppose the first thing we have to ask ourselves, guys, is whilst we did get that confirmation, are we surprised that the details of such confirmation didn't really come to light, i.e., in Red Bull's case, how much they had overspent the budget cap by? We've heard rumours by about 1 million or 2 million, but we're not quite sure the actual figure. And also the procedural breaches committed by Aston Martin and Red Bull, are they ones that would imply that they committed fraudulent activity, or are they just ones in terms of just, not necessarily misleading, but not filing paperwork properly on time, or other things like that? What were your thoughts on that one, guys? Courtney, let you go first.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. We know that when it comes to subjects like this, these things seem to drag out. To an extent, it's understandable because you can't be publishing things without, the full facts. And I'm sure Red Bull will have their reasoning behind the exceeding the cost cap, which I'm sure they'll be keen to put out there. And obviously, you have to be very careful because you're dealing with matters here that are potentially, legal. You've had phrases of defamation being thrown around, so you have to be careful of publishing news unless you're 100% is true. And that's why I think it took so long for the FIA to release the documents. But at the same time, it is very, very frustrating for the fan base. And I touched on this in the last episode. I think it's one of the reasons why the F1 fan base has become so polarized and at times toxic. And it's because of the lack of clarity from the people at the very top. In last episode, we were accused of, whinging a lot, etc., etc. And it's because we're frustrated. We're frustrated because we love this sport, and we're just seeing a very, very sort of toxic environment within the fan base, and it is because of lack of clarity. All we want is clarity. Trust me, we have plenty of positive things to say about the sport, but we want to have these kind of subjects dealt with once and for all, because I think we're all sick of talking about the 2021 season. It was a fantastic season, but by God, was it a negative one? So we just want closure to 2021 once and for all, and move on to what we hope is a entertaining 2023, because F1 really does need the lift, because the sport that we love right now, we feel is being dragged through the mud.
Well, this is it, and I think that's a really, really good point. We all often hear about this, what's this phrase, like the spirit of the rules or the interpretation of these rules. And the budget cap for this year has certainly opened a lot of people's eyes as to what possible different interpretations of these rules that there can be. And I think for clarity, what Red Bull are being investigated for are sort of cost classifications, certain costings that they've put down in their own financial statements when they submitted this to the FIA, and what they believe to be, filed under as costs that should be classified in this cost cap versus some costs that haven't been. They've submitted that. Christian Horner was very adamant that they were below the cost cap. The FIA have looked through all of this. They've done their own audit, and they're of the opinion that Red Bull have actually gone over the cost cap. So there's obviously a parity there. I think what we do need to make very, very clear to people listening to this show on their favourite podcasting platform or watching this on YouTube, subscribe and like if you can, by the way, is that Red Bull, what they have done, it's not fraudulent activity. And I think this is really important because a lot of people are saying, they've breached the budget cap. According to the FIA, they have. In their own estimations, they haven't. So, of course, we'll have to wait and see how that pans out, because I'm sure Red Bull are going to be pursuing other action to sort of fight this, which I'm sure they will do in due course. But what's important to recognise and remember here is that whilst, according to the FIA, Red Bull have breached the budget cap, Red Bull have not done this in a way where they've tried to mislead anyone over certain spending or costings that they've made throughout 2021. They have complied with certain procedures in how to classify certain costs, but their interpretation of that versus the FIA's interpretation of this are two different things. So this kind of, I think for the benefit of people that aren't really familiar with how this is going to affect what potential punishment they could get if a punishment is given to them on this, when, later down the line, it's important to remember that what Red Bull have done here is not try to be fraudulent or try to mislead anyone or try to hide certain costings or certain spending. They have been very compliant up to a point, and it's now just a case of whose interpretation is correct. And the reason why I keep going on about interpretation is, again, as Courtney, you already said, it's something that a lot of people that watched this episode, watched the Japanese Grand Prix episode, I should say, and they weren't happy with some of the things that we were saying owing to being annoyed at the interpretation of the rules. The spirit of the rules has been something that's been thrown about a lot since last season, since what happened in Abu Dhabi. And I think one person in particular said that, oh, you guys need to read the rules, what the FI did was correct. And in fairness, they were absolutely correct in what they did in awarding 4 points for the race. But the problem is that not only did people not understand this ruling because people didn't even know it existed, they just assumed that the points were going to be awarded based on how much of the race distance was completed. So there's a different interpretation there. But if we're going by that and saying by that comment alone that we received in feedback that we should read the rules are written as they are and they should be, honoured to by the letter of the law. If we did that in Abu Dhabi last season, let's not mince words about this. Lewis Hamilton would be an 8-time world champion right now. We wouldn't even be having the Abu Dhabi discussion if the rules were followed as they were written exactly. That's why we had that controversy in the first place. To then go from that to here, where we're accepting a different interpretation there to how the rules were written to what is actually written now, you get two different answers. You create that kind of parity. It creates that controversy. It creates those differences in perspective and opinion that everybody on social media or in mainstream media is arguing about left, right and centre. It all becomes trivial and it all becomes the massive mess that we're currently ciphering through when it comes to talking about what's going on in F1. And it's extended now to the budget cap, this interpretation of the budget cap regulations. I do want to have it on record. I actually do like what the budget cap is trying to achieve here. But ultimately what we've seen from the first year of this budget cap is so many different interpretations coming from Red Bull, coming from Aston Martin in this case, well, depending on what they've done, and the FIA, different interpretations from Mercedes and Ferrari that have gone out and said some things about Red Bull and they've not, been honourable or not done this or not done that, and some of the other teams as well. We need to make these rules much more concise. We need to make sure that they're tightened up to the point there's no parity, there's no confusion. It's simply put, if you spend over the budget cap, you will be punished. And that's something that we'll get into a little bit more over this minor versus major thing. Lee, I want to get your thoughts on this because as I said already and just kind of monologued on a little bit, the spirit of the regulations, something that Adrian Newey quite famously hates. He said that, the rules are written the way they are. There's no case for trying to interpret the rules a certain way depending on how you read them. You read them in black and white as they are. There should be no grey areas. Ultimately, that seems to be something that what we have with this budget cap situation right now. Where do you kind of stand on this issue? Are you someone that feels that the interpretation needs to be made clear to everybody, or everyone should just follow the rules as they are written?
Well, I think with the Formula One and the FIA and their rules, is the FIA is really bad at following its own rules. You just picking up an example of the white lines. In the rules, the circuit is defined by the white lines. Obviously, I'm only paraphrasing because I don't know the rules. I just know the exact ruling, but the circuit is defined by the white lines. Some parts of the track, you can take all four wheels off the circuit because you're deemed not getting an advantage. They don't do anything, but you're off the circuit. But on other parts, they monitor, but the rules state that you've got to remain on the circuit. So you should monitor all parts of the circuit and not go off the track. But the FA changes their mind, and sometimes they're really harsh to the stewards, and sometimes they're not, and sometimes it flip flops from race, it flip flops from years, and that's just a simple rule that the FA doesn't follow itself. Let alone before you get about race distances or safety car procedures. And the FA need to understand their own rules and follow them properly. And I agree with Adrian Newey that the rules can be misleading. There shouldn't be grey areas. It should be black and white, and that is the rules of the rule, and that is it. If you like the outcome of the rules, tough. That is the rule. Because when you don't follow the rules, in the FA's case, or all the time, or there's a grey area because you haven't clarified it enough. But then the problem is with Formula One that if you do all these clarifications and things because the teams are looking for an advantage, the rule book gets even thicker because you've got to have Appendix A, Appendix B, Appendix C, Item 1, and then you get to all these items because obviously the teams are looking for their own advantage again in the competition. So it's a really bad situation that Formula One's found itself regarding following the rules in the last couple of years. And it's a shame to see that obviously sport has lost its way a bit in regarding rules and things. But I do want to throw a question back to you, Adam, we've got this situation with Red Bull's interpretation, and they believe they were fine last year. And just a thought of mine is if they believe they were fine last year, are we going to find ourselves in a similar position next year because Red Bull have done the same practice this year because they didn't do anything wrong last year in their minds and their interpretation of the rules. So we're going to get another saga next year because Red Bull have done this year what they did last year.
I mean, it's quite possible, isn't it? Because and this is why it's important for these grey areas to be tightened up, these loose ends, if you like, to be tightened up, for a better metaphor. And as I said, it could affect them for 2022. I mean, we could be revisiting this in a year's time, or it should be around about July time when it should have been done originally. But all these delays and everything else, I can only put that down to how complicated this has been, and obviously ongoing feedback between the likes of Aston Martin, Red Bull, other teams as well, even the ones that have complied, obviously would have had queries on certain things to make sure that they did things right, by which 7 of them did. You can argue Williams to a degree also did as well. They just, missed a deadline for filing some documents and stuff like that, which is, it is a mistake and they were fined for. It's not like the end of the world. It's just one of those things that can happen sometimes in that accounting process. But in this case, there is a real need for the FIA to make sure that, as I said, such grey areas are sort of dealt with. It's a lot more black and white. It's clear and easy to understand. And regulations put in place so that we're not having to sort of go back and forth over these different things, different interpretations. Yes, there will always be queries of what you can and can't get away with, but there's been so much parity going on right here, which has ultimately led us to where we are today. We could, forget about Red Bull overspending. Of course, that's a big thing, and I'm of the opinion where I don't really see why we have minor and major spends. I mean, look, one thing that I've been very annoyed about, to sort of divert this conversation to a different direction, actually, if I can, is the fact that we haven't been told how much Red Bull have overspent. What we understand and what a lot of people have been made to believe is that this is a minor overspend breach, somewhere in the lines of roughly $1.8 to $2 million. Now, a minor overspend in this case is around 5%. That could be upwards of nearly $7 million, give or take. That's a huge amount of money. That, in theory, that is. So I think someone said the other day that's about Alfa Romeo's 3 years worth of development spending for Alfa Romeo. Again, I heard that as a random quote on social media, so take that for what it's worth. But for anyone that knows anything about how F1's finances work, know that no team spends that much money in this era on their development budget. So, I mean, that could be the equivalent of a B-spec car, or massive amounts of changes to floors and front wings and everything else, to the point where you have a massive advantage on your rivals, and that's considered a minor overspend, let alone one that would be a major overspend of anything more than that. I mean, the whole point of this budget cap was to bring spending down and equalise the field. Teams like Haas that don't have a lot of money to spend, they don't even have a proper permanent factory, versus Red Bull, for example, or Ferrari or Mercedes that have all these facilities. It has served well to bring it down to the point where the teams can be competitive. But I think you really need to disclose this information to these teams and make sure that any confusion or any wrong interpretations of these regulations are qualmed as soon as possible. And more importantly, information on these breaches are made clear and public as sooner than they have been. And we still don't know how much Red Bull has spent. We don't know what procedural breaches that they've committed, or Aston Martin, what procedural breaches they've committed. They could be really bad ones, but we don't know at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think, like, we're talking 2021 here. You look how close it was last season. It literally went to the last lap. The Drivers' Championship went to the last lap. If Red Bull have overspent by 1.8 million, I'm sorry, that must have made a difference to the performance of that Red Bull towards the latter end of the season. I have no doubts about that whatsoever. So that has to be looked into, because that could have decided the outcome of the championship. And some of the comments we had in the last episode again was like, well, we didn't see this kind of outrage, whenever Lewis Hamilton made any breaches, etc., etc. Let's go back to 2021 again in Brazil, when Lewis Hamilton got disqualified over the DRS flat being 0.2 millimeters out of range. He got disqualified. We sometimes forget about that because Lewis went on to win that race. That decision could have cost Lewis Hamilton that world championship. So again, I think we sometimes get accused of being biased because, we have our favourite teams and drivers. I have examples here. I've written down examples here of moments where other teams have been hurt when they've been deemed to not follow the regulation. And we always ask for this, for it to be fair. And we expect this from every sport. We just want to see fairness. We want to see clarity, and we want to see consistency. That is all we're asking for. I want to congratulate Red Bull for winning the 2021 championships and the 2022 championships. If I'm confident as a fan, the rules have been followed, in which all the other teams have followed, because 7 teams have followed the rules. Red Bull haven't. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think we need to make this clear, because a lot of people, not necessarily ones that were defending Red Bull, but I think the line that was being put out to everyone, that the overspend that they had was a minor one, around about 1 to 2 million. I mean, 1 to 2 million is still a large amount of money and can go some way.
I could do with 1.8 to 2 million.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't. What is it they say? It's around about, in order to gain lap time, I think like $1 million in resource spending equates to around about a tenth of a second per lap. We know the fine margins between Sir Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. You couldn't separate them for most of that season from one race to another. Let's hypothetically say $2 million went on spending on Max Verstappen's car. That's 0.2 of a second. That's 0.2 of a second that he wouldn't have had for however long he had that advantage for, which could ultimately have decided the world championship one way or the other. I mean, we know the way it went down, that Lewis Hamilton was faster than Max in the last few races. He obviously had a better car. He was driving a bit better as well, to some degree as well. Max started to make a few mistakes here and there. Brazil, Jeddah, an example, when mistakes were made from him. That advantage that he had, the US Grand Prix is a great example. He managed to hold Lewis off. It was a brilliant performance. If he had that hypothetical 2/10 advantage on Lewis, would he have kept him behind him at that race? Would Lewis have won that race? Probably. If he had done, Lewis would have won the world championship
France
regardless.
As well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just kind of speculating and throwing random things out here to try and justify the point I'm making here. I'm not suggesting that this is what would have happened, but hypothetically speaking, you can make an argument for this. And I know the line from Red Bull was that through Dutch press, I believe it was, I can't remember the exact source, but I know this is one that was thrown about on social media, was that it was owing to cost classifications on catering. This is where we got all those brilliant memes. It was absolutely hilarious. And look, even if you're a Red Bull fan and you saw this and you're a little bit gritting your teeth at this because you're a bit angry, you've got to admit it was quite funny. There was the brilliance of social media comes out when people make memes on this, and this is something that F1 has really taken ages to catch up with compared to other sports. But I'm finally glad it's here. It is quite funny. Some of the stuff that people were saying, not necessarily cost capping or anything stupid like that, where they're attacking Max. I think we need to make this clear as well whilst we're here. Anyone that goes out and uses this to attack Max Verstappen is an idiot. I don't mind. Yeah, I don't mind saying this on this podcast, because I know some people that don't like Max will probably be annoyed about that. But the fact is that he has been the one constant in all of this that has actually just done what he should be doing. I know people that will say, oh, well, he was a bit aggressive against Lewis here, or he did this, or he did that. I get that. But Max Verstappen didn't cheat in 2021 to win the World Championship in Abu Dhabi. He did what he was supposed to do. He made the move. He took advantage of the situation and he won. He also didn't decide how much to spend on his car for 2022 either, if we go to 2022 and find out they've overspent there. He used the machine he had, he did the job he had to do, and he's a deserving world champion. Whether he's going to end up keeping both of them, one of them, or none of them remains to be seen. But one thing I don't accept that people have done is use this to attack Max Verstappen, regardless of what camp they're in, whether they're a Ferrari fan, whether they're a Hamilton fan, or whether they just want to stir up the pot to make trouble. I don't care. Quite frankly, I don't get it. And it's just ridiculous that people do that, because all it does is just create tension and create arguments and create divides. We don't need this in the sport. You know, it's okay to be a fan of one driver or another, but I don't accept people trying to use this to score cheap points, to try and attack Max Verstappen or even attack Sir Lewis for whatever reason. I don't know where they come with that one from, but this is social media for you, and this is F1 social media these days. It is what it is. But as I said, the earlier point regarding these costings is that it doesn't really matter what they spent this extra money on. The fact is they've spent more money than everybody else, more money than what was permitted. And that is where the problem is. And it should be treated as such. It doesn't matter what they spent. I mean, for all we know, Courtney and Lee, they could have bought $2 million worth of Red Bull branded coffee mugs, like the DNF1 mug, for example. Doesn't really matter. You've overspent. You have to cut your costings to meet the budget cap. Don't care how you do it, as long as you meet the budget cap. Ultimately, according to the FIA's interpretation of the budget cap, Red Bull have failed to do that. And as a result, they will need to be punished for it.
I know, I just want to add on. I just like to say, because I posted it everywhere. I called this outcome, at least 24 hours before the outcome. I jokingly put on our group chat that I guarantee that the outcome from Red Bull's side is that they spent the excess money on tea and biscuits. And I mean, I wasn't far off. They said it's down to catering costs. So I'm just saying, you've got a clairvoyant in this in the DNF1 panel, and I hope you're proud that you've got someone as clairvoyant as myself.
Yeah,
joining the podcast.
If we have someone that's got the hindsight vision, being 2020 and all that, I might need to ask you some questions regarding some future races and world champions. Or maybe, Courtney, you can tell us what's going to happen with this cost cap thing and save us a discussion on it. You can just tell everybody what's going to happen.
Nicholas Latifi is going to be the 2023 world champion. There you go. It's my prediction.
Well, I've heard stranger things, although I have to go somewhere to try and figure that one out. Speaking of which, though, guys, I mean, look, we've already talked about these procedural breaches. We don't know what they are exactly. We've also talked about the budget cap, how much Red Bull have overspent. Of course, we should mention that a lot of people have been saying that their overspend has been minor. The current penalties that exist for minor overspends are pretty much like minor sporting penalties, a public reprimand being one of them, deduction of constructors and championship points, deduction of drivers' championship points, suspension from one or more stages of a competition, but not the race itself, reduction of future cost caps, and also reduction of development time for future seasons. Before I reveal what our followers voted on in a poll that you did on Instagram, Courtney, what kind of punishments do you expect to see from the FIA, and how important is it for them, for the future of this cost cap and the budget cap in future seasons? How important is it for them to get this punishment right, whether it's not too harsh or not harsh enough?
I personally think it's going to be a fine or some kind of reprimand, because some of the punishments that we're seeing dished out from the FIA do seem to be quite lenient, in my opinion. So I do think it will be a fine and a reprimand. Going on what I think should happen going forward, and it's something that you've touched on, Lee, as well, in previous episodes, when the rumours were going around about Red Bull possibly going over the limit, is that if a team has been breaking these cost cap regulations, they've been talking about this for years, and why it's important to make F1 more sustainable and to make it more competitive and to make it cheaper for other teams to join in. It is a very important set of regulations they've brought in. And I'm going to touch on what you said, Lee, because I completely agree, mate, is that if a team has broken the regulations, they need to be made an example of. And I would be saying the same if it was Mercedes. You have to make examples of any team to breach the regulations for it to be, for the regulations to be adhered to. Because say Red Bull, for example, get a reprimand or a fine, they're like, meh. Red Bull, one of the richest teams in the sport, they're not going to care about that. So they do need to be made an example of. And I just want to echo something that Martin Brundle, I have a lot of respect and time for Martin Brundle. He always seems to be very philosophical about F1. He said that Red Bull need to be hurt for any cost cap breaches that they're made. And he's right, because, again, they need to be made an example of. And we have seen, again, going back to my notes here, I don't often make notes, but I have for this one. You have a look at some of the past issues of other teams. and they have been hurt by it. So if you look at the Ferrari engine settlement in 2019, some people say, oh, it was a bit sketchy. It was sketchy, but Ferrari were hurt by it. They were at the back of the grid in 2020. They were struggling. It's probably one of the worst Ferraris we've seen for years. They were hit in 2020. They were hit in 2021. So they got punished for it. When Mercedes had the DAS system taken away in 2021, if they still had the DAS system in 2021, we might not even be having this conversation, because Mercedes would have been able to heat up their tyres a lot more often and have a performance advantage. So we have seen many advantages. We've had situations like this before, perceived breaches of regulations. The teams have been hurt by it, and then they'll learn not to do it again. So it's important that any team that breaks these kind of regulations with the cost cap, they get hurt by it to ensure that they're made an example of, and we don't see it happen time and time again in the future.
Yeah, what do you reckon, Lee?
Well, I think that the FA is going to make a mess of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it's going to upset one fans are going to be any outcome. There will be fans that won't be happy with it. But what I mean is that the FA will just mess it up. They will. They won't do. I personally think they won't do a harsh enough punishment to make an example of Red Bull, because I've already said in a previous episode that I think they need to basically throw the book at Red Bull. Just because I don't agree with cheating, regardless of what it was spent on. And it wasn't intended cheating or fraudulent activity, like you said, Adam. But I'm very black and white now. If you broke the rules, you've cheated.
Exactly.
So I think they should throw the book at them in regarding the punishment to make the example, which Corny just said. But I think the FA will just do a small fine. I say small, and for me, I would love to have that kind of money. But it would be like a $30 million fine, and that would be it. And then Mercedes, Ferrari go, we can afford that to spend over $2 extra million. Yeah,
spot on.
32 million. So it's going to then boil in next year. And then Mercedes and Ferrari get punished next year, for example. And then they go, well, you didn't punish Red Bull. We've only just spent as much as they did last year. And I say Ferrari, FA will be like, we didn't mean for this to happen. No. And it just blows their mind that they think another team will intentionally break the rules because they didn't punish Red Bull. And I just think the FA are just going to complete an utter mess of this.
They will
go on for a year or two just to fall out from this. It's just the FA don't know how to enforce their rules properly at the moment, and which is a shame to say. It's just my perception of the sport at the moment.
Well, this is it. And as I said, I think Karan Chandok made this point about the cost cap announcement on, who was compliant and who wasn't. And he made the point that it's been 10 months since the end of last season. And when all the findings would have been submitted, all the audits would have obviously started to take place. And we're still waiting to find out the details of the breaches that were committed. We've just heard what type of breaches they are. We haven't heard any details regarding not only the budget breach, but also the procedural ones as well for Aston Martin in particular, and Red Bull. They've also committed some procedural breaches. We can't forget that. So it's two things that they're being looked at for, not just the one. But at the same time, the whole point of this cost cap was to equalise the field as best as they can. There was always going to be a parity because only 3 teams on the current grid were going to be affected by this to the point where they had to bring their costs down. And that was Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull. 2 of which are major car manufacturers that obviously use the road car industry and their financial might within that industry to, power their Formula 1 teams. Another one is a well-known energy drinks brand. And of course, Red Bull technologies that come into that as well, all a part of that. So the other teams, they were always going to have to bring their spending up, or at least manage what they were doing in the same way they always were, whereas the other 3 teams had to be more efficient. We often heard Toto Wolff talking about staff being made redundant. Christian Horner came back with this and said, well, he's singing a sob story, but we also had to do that as well. In fact, we had to make more people redundant. So it was a kind of case of, well, we had to do more than you, that kind of thing. Look, it is what it is. These teams had to make adjustments, and Ferrari did have to do that too, but they also seconded people to other teams. Like a lot of people went over to Haas where permitted, to keep them in jobs and stuff like that. That's how it was. There's a lot of pressure here to get this right. Lee, you mentioned money fines of, if 30 million as hypothetically as you mentioned. A fine like that, whilst it seems hefty to most teams, with the money that Red Bull have made from this deal with Oracle and a few other sponsorship deals, are basically pocket change at this point.
Yep.
And I would not feel comfortable with a reprimand, even though I've made the case that what Red Bull have done is not fraudulent, it's just, different interpretations of their spending classification compared to what the FIA do. Like, for example, one thing that came up was salaries that were being spent on illness of staff that were obviously not included in the budget cap, whereas the FIA did include them in their interpretation. A few other things as well, like tax credits and stuff like this that Red Bull wouldn't have been made aware of, so they wouldn't have included that as like a refund on certain things that they bought. The FIA didn't give them the benefit of the doubt on that from their interpretation, from what I understand. So little things like this, I'm just plucking a few examples of rumours of things that I've heard, not necessarily stuff that's been formally published, to stuff that we can actually refer to try and argue this one way or the other. So I need to make that clear to people when I say this. So I don't know, a fine's not going to cut it anyway, and it certainly wouldn't cut it with the other teams. Ross Brawn, when this cost cap idea was formulated and the original concept of it was being brought out and sold to Formula One, basically said, and I quote, breach financial rules, lose your championship. That was the stance he took back in 2019. And it was very much a stern, hardcore approach on this. We're basically saying to teams that we're having a zero tolerance policy on this cost cap, and if you overspend on it, you could lose your championship or suffer a sporting penalty like that. There are different penalties in place, like the technical regulations. When you breach the technical regulations, there's like some penalties for that. There's also sporting penalties in terms of like points, deductions, and other things like this. Hypothetically, guys, based on that quote from Ross Brawn and what the original the original thought process on what was on the warning to teams in terms of those that might have felt that, we could afford to breach this budget cap if we're just going to get a fine. We can afford to overspend this much, win the championship, just pay the fine afterwards. How would you feel about a scenario where Red Bull, based on everything that we've talked about already, based on the nature of their breaches and the fact that they haven't been fraudulent, they have been compliant to a degree, but it's mostly about interpretations of certain spending costs which are different from theirs in the FIA's audit on their own cost cap analysis, if you like. What is your thoughts regarding the possibility of a world championship being taken away from Max Verstappen and a Constructors' Championship being taken away from Red Bull in 2022 if similar issues occur for this one? Do you think that would be a fair punishment based on what we know about the definition, I suppose, of Red Bull's breach in this case, or how they've gone about it?
If Max had the 2021 championship taken away, I would believe, to be fair, because I already touched on it before, given how close that was in the end in the Drivers' Championship, that kind of money that Red Bull been rumoured to have been in excess of would have made a difference, given how close it was in that championship. If they were to apply it for this season, it would be unfair. But you're right, Adam, we don't know what budget the budget outcomes are going to be for next season. So I'm only talking about the breaches that were made for 2021. I think taking away Max's championship would be fair, only because of the small margin there was between the two drivers. If Max had won by, 30 to 50 points, I'd say, no, that's harsh. Max had driven, like this season, in a league of his own. He clearly won that championship. But because of the margin that it ended between the two drivers, literally in the last lap of the season, I do believe taking away Max's championship would be fair. I think punishing Red Bull with Constructors' points would make no difference as well, because they didn't win the Constructors' Championship. If it is to happen this season, then of course, because it'd be their first Constructors' Championship since 2013. So it would hurt them. And I do believe that the most rewarding championship is the Drivers' Championship. Of course, they want to win the Constructors, but the Drivers' Championship is the main one. It is a true jewel in the crown. So taking away a Drivers' Championship would be, would make the biggest example out of Red Bull. But yeah, if it was to happen this season, I wouldn't be as for it, because I think, barring a major breach in Red Bull spending this season, I can't see how you can say that didn't deserve to win his championship because they've blown the field away this season.
Lee, what about you? Do you think points deduction, which would result in potentially a world championship being taken away, as a fair punishment for a breach of this nature?
Yeah, I personally, as I mentioned, I think they should throw the book at Red Bull. The metaphorically, that is, not literally. But
we don't condone violence on this channel, do we?
Exactly. But as a minor breach, it's one of the harshest punishments available to the FIA is the deduction of points. And therefore, I think that it should be used as the harshest punishment, which is deduction of constructors and construction of team points, constructors' points. And that's what they should do, and limit development time for 23. Obviously, obviously, I would say development time limited for this year, but as we've nearly finished this year, limited development time, there's no point applying it to this year because any advantage they may have gained on development for this year is already being used. So as Courtney said, unless they've found to repeat it again this year, as I raised as my hypothetical question, then that's a question for this year's budget, because we obviously haven't finished. But you can't apply it to this year for development because they've already used it. But at the very least, I think there should be deduction of points for both constructor and driver, and limited of development time.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, a lot of people have cited this. There's certainly a lot of pressure for the FIA to deal with in terms of how they're going to go about administering what they believe to be the correct punishment. Because whilst I totally understand that because of how close the championship was last season between Max Verstappen and Sir Lewis Hamilton, that any points deduction of significance to Max would ultimately result in his first championship being taken away from him. And I'm not necessarily a fan of this idea of going back and rewriting the history books every time this sort of things happen. However, it must be said that it is very important to lay down a marker in its first season where obviously there are going to be mixed changes and interpretations, and this will be an opportunity to set a precedent going forward on what is permissible, what isn't permissible, despite the fact that the rules were supposed to be written down and honoured to the letter, something that has been cited a lot for different scenarios. Courtney, you mentioned the one with Sir Lewis Hamilton where his rear wing was, uncompliant by like 0.2 of a millimetre, and that got him an automatic DQ from qualifying. Regardless of what he ended up doing to recover that anyway, that didn't really matter in the end. But, minus the fact that, the sprint race, he could have won that sprint race instead of, coming, fifth? I think it was. He could have got more points as a result of that. So I suppose that's an argument you can make to say how he was affected. But there are different interpretations in terms of how strict the punishment is for one rule break versus a punishment for another rule break. So it's a hard one. I certainly don't envy the people on the FIA that have to come up with a suitable punishment for this. I'm not 100% sure if I would agree with the FIA, given the nature in these breaches for Red Bull, in that they've not been fraudulent or misleading. It's just come down to they've cited certain things differently to what the FIA has. Ultimately, you would think the FIA are just going to stick to their guns and say, well, this is what we interpret it as. Everybody else followed the spending rules. All the 9 other teams spent within the cost cap. It was just Red Bull that did this. Ultimately, the team that's gone on to win not only last season's Drivers' Championship, but to the 2022 one as well. And obviously would have a baked-in advantage if, as Lee, you pointed out already, that they could have spent over the cost cap for this season by doing what they did last year if they're already in breach that. So that is that to consider going forward as well. Because of this, I think a more likely punishment that they're going to get, again, this is assuming that they've done everything that's been rumoured and reported has been, gospel truth. And to be honest, why wouldn't we think that? Because everything that was reported in Singapore has come to light as well. It seems to be on the money, no pun intended, in this case. I feel a more realistic punishment will probably be a reduction in future spending. So perhaps by the amount that they've exceeded the budget cap for this season, and perhaps double that. So for example, if you spent $1 million over the budget cap, your budget cap will be reduced for the following year by $2 million, so that you actually feel some punishment. It's not a case of like trying to conjure it off or offset what you did before. And the same goes for the wind tunnel time or the ATR regs. Of course, Red Bull for this season, are going to be the Constructors' Champions at this point. I mean, they're so far ahead, a points deduction would be kind of irrelevant for this season anyway, if it was that they breached the regulations. So perhaps to even up the playing field or give other teams an opportunity to catch up, we reduce Red Bull's development time or wind tunnel running time by a certain degree, in addition to the cost cap reduction for future seasons, so that they can feel some level of pain. The only problem with that is people will say, oh, well, you need other teams to catch up. They still have that Bates and advantage, which they can use up to a point by which they could run away with the World Championship for 2023. It's a really hard one to determine. As I said, lots of things to consider here. I'm not 100% sure what punishment I would go with, but I just don't feel comfortable, unless it's something majorly fraudulent or something really bad, which is not what Red Bull seem to have done in this case. I must stress that. Based on what's being reported, I don't think it's a good idea to try and rewrite the history books all the time, but it is important for the FIA to get this right. They have to put down a precedent which makes this budget cap something that will be followed, because if they don't, as you said, Lee, as you said, Courtney, I can see a scenario where the FIA will have a problem with teams just saying, well, or Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull, for example, saying, oh, well, forget this, we're just going to spend £300 million every year as we have been before. And, you know, it'll be like 2013 all over again with like the equal resourcing thing, where that completely just didn't get followed and people just ignored it, and then that got ripped up. So there's a lot of pressure on the FIA here. One thing I did want to bring to you guys' attention on this as well is sort of Red Bull's reaction to all of this. Now, we've heard from Ferrari and Mercedes and some other teams, they want a severe punishment. They want a precedent to be set on this one. Red Bull are still of the opinion where they feel like that they've done nothing wrong, they've done everything right now, and they're going to take legal action they're going to pursue legal action for the next steps. And it's a bit strange because Red Bull have been going on arguing about defamation. So I'm wondering where the lines are going to come out, where they're basically going to say the FIA are in trouble of legal action being thrown against them for defamation against us, as they've been throwing threats at other teams. I'm just going to read a quote from Red Bull, if I may, on this, on their response to the FIA cost cap publication. They basically said, we note the findings by the FIA or minor overspend breaches of the financial regulations with sorry, I'm reading this absolutely wrong. I'm making a pig's ear of this. With surprise and disappointment. Apologies. Our 2021 submission was below the cost cap limit, so we need to carefully review the FIA's findings, as our belief remains that the relevant costs are under the 2021 cost cap amount. Despite the conjecture and positioning of others, there is, of course, a process under the regulations with the FIA which we will respectfully follow whilst we consider all of the options available to us. Now, whilst they've not gone out and complained about the FIA in a way that they did about the other teams and claiming that they've sort of, you know, like defamation and stuff like that, they kind of have sort of done that subtly. They've also basically subtly threatened legal action by basically saying that we'll consider all the options available to us, which I'd imagine they may take to real life court, not the FIA court that we heard so much about following the Abu Dhabi controversy. I just look at that and I feel like we're not going to get a resolution to this anytime soon, guys. I think this one could drag on for some time. It could also be a case of Red Bull just trying to flex their financial wealth and saying, oh, well, we can afford high price, high quality legal counsel or stuff like that, like threatening the FIA on this one to try and loosen their stance on this. What did you make of Red Bull's response?
Well, for me, they've been adamant that they haven't done anything wrong, which, as you said, is their interpretation. But I believe with the rulings, if they accept the punishment, they potentially get a lighter punishment, because if it goes to the FIA court, it's more likely to be a harsher punishment. It's my understanding of the rules. Obviously, correct me wrong, guys, from that. I'm just paraphrasing my understanding.
Don't worry, our listeners will do that for us, Lee. Yeah. If you're wrong, they'll let us know in the comment section on YouTube. So don't worry.
Thank you, everyone, for letting me know.
They've got us covered. We love them for it.
But the fact that they come out this strong, it shows you the strength of their conviction that they haven't done anything wrong. Because if they believe they were guilty, they'll take the lighter punishment and go, yeah, okay, you've caught us. Oops. But so the fact they're long, and obviously the potential, as you said, the actual legal, not FIA legal. I mean, nationality, law, country law defining legal. That is worrisome, and it does for me raise the question of, could we potentially see Red Bull walk away from the sport because they feel that they're being defamed by the ruling body and the other teams? As how magistrates go, I'm not going to be involved in this. Well, we bring a lot of money to sports around the world, and they don't insult us. They don't say we're bad sports. Everyone here is saying we're bad sport and we cheat. We haven't cheated. I'm going to walk away and take my money elsewhere where it's appreciated. Could we see that scenario happening?
Yeah, we've heard this one thrown about before, like Red Bull, even Ferrari to a degree, threaten to walk away from the sport if they don't get their way. It's it's just one of those things. Obviously, I don't think anyone really would take that seriously anymore.
No.
Especially with the Concord Agreement up to 2025 or something like that. So, yeah, it is a weird one with this legal action. I wouldn't rule anything out right now, but I feel like Red Bull coming out with the stance that whilst they will pursue all the options available to them, in their own mind probably saying, look, if we have to take legal action on this, then we will do so because we believe our interpretation is correct, the FIA's is wrong. Where have we heard that one before? Interpretation being the key word in this episode quite clearly, and this is a big thing with Formula One at the moment. But Red Bull trying not to rock the boat as well, trying to understand what the FIA are doing. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of discussion over some of these differences that have been cited, between one version of the Red Bull spending for 2021 versus the other version from the FIA. So I don't expect this to end anytime soon. Courtney, what have you made of all of this really with Red Bull? Can you really see a scenario where we end up with a big, massive, blown-out court case in real people court, not the FIA court, over this issue, especially in a scenario where if Red Bull lose, the punishment will be to lose their world championships?
It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest because we know how political F1 is, and I've been keeping an eye on Red Bull's development to the position they are now. They are very much the team to beat, and it's all been political games by the likes of Christian Horner and Helmut Marko. It started in 2019 with the sort of forming allegiance with Mercedes to investigate Ferrari, followed by the keenness to disqualify Mercedes from the Austrian Grand Prix in 2020 because they felt the DAS system was blatantly illegal. You got the changes in the regulations in 2021, taking away the DAS system, which benefited Red Bull. And we're just seeing a lot of political lobbying from Christian Horner in particular, which has given them a political advantage, I feel. I've been very vocal about this over the last couple of years. All the teams do it. I'm not just saying it's just Christian Horner, but I do feel that Christian Horner is very good at getting his point across. And it would surprise me at all. Red Bull are going to be very keen to keep their advantage, so they will do anything within their power to keep themselves in the position that they're currently in.
Yeah, I do sympathise with Red Bull and Christian Horner a little bit on this, because obviously they've had to come out and publicly defend themselves for the last couple of weeks, especially in a period where it should be more about celebrating their success and celebrating Max Verstappen's success. And of course, I say that there's obviously going to be an asterisk or some caveats to this, because right now a lot of it is potentially in jeopardy with this budget cap business, not only for 2021 but also for 2022 as well. But ultimately it's all come out because information has been leaked from someone at the FIA, has leaked this information to the likes of Ferrari, Mercedes and a few others, which has allowed them to go on the attack with Red Bull. I mean, Toto Wolff was saying that Red Bull have been under investigation for 6 months now. And if he's right on that, then someone has obviously, leaked this information out to them. And Ferrari and others as well that are obviously trying to call for severe punishments for Red Bull. And for me, that's just unacceptable. I mean, this is something that the FIA are meant to be dealing with, and it's meant to be quite sensitive and discreet. And there's been a lot of pressure on them to sort of publish their findings. And obviously there've been delays after delays after delays. The FIA even came out and basically told everyone to shut up and stop making up rumours and stuff like that. But ultimately, this has come from someone within that structure that has leaked this information out, which has proven to be correct. I mean, it's not like a scenario has happened where Toto Wolff and Mattia Binotto have gone out and joined forces to attack Christian Horner and Red Bull with information which is ultimately false. What they said was ultimately correct, and the rumours in the paddock was ultimately spot on. So, for me, I think the FIA look a little bit stupid coming out and saying that when clearly the issue for them is to tighten up their own structures or stop people leaking information out, which is causing others to attack Red Bull in this way. I don't think it's really fair for them to have to face all of that at the time when we should have been talking about or focusing on what Red Bull are they happy about winning the World Championship and stuff like that. That's something I think is worth noting, and something the FIA do need to make sure for future reference that this information does not get disclosed before it should be. Perhaps ultimately is why such details of the procedural breaches that have been committed or the financial breaches that have been committed have not been disclosed to us at this point in time. I mean, obviously I'm keen to get your thoughts on this one as well, guys. It's just something I wanted to share because it did annoy me as well, because it's kind of irrelevant. All it's done is just served this, how can I put this, served this sort of tension and arguments on social media between different parties and all this defamation, if you like, all this silly stuff that really shouldn't be a part of Formula One, quite frankly.
Well, yeah, it goes back to what we're talking about at the very beginning of this episode. And in fact, the last episode, we were accused of whinging, this, that, and the other. We were complaining a lot, but it's simply because we don't feel the sport is being governed correctly and actually professionally. It isn't being run properly. It makes the sport. We've got to remember, we are here. We are here doing an F1 podcast. Those that are listening, we are all doing this because we are big fans of Formula One. And you've got to look from outside of the sport itself. So you've got people that are new to the sport. I just think all these sort of different things have been discussing, and the point you just made right now about the leaks, it makes the sport look a joke. It makes the sport look like a joke. During a time which is important for the sport, it's growing in popularity. This is a real opportunity for F1 to kick on as a sport and put itself up there with some of the other sports that are more established, like football, to an extent, like NFL and sports in America. It's growing in Americas as well. We've got to remember that F1 has a prime opportunity here to grow. I just think the way it's been governed makes it look like a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I heard rumours that Liberty Media were very unhappy with the FIA at the moment because they've been working tirelessly to improve the show, and they've introduced new innovations like Drive to Survive and a few other races in certain venues to improve the show for F1. And the FIA right now are just not really doing what they should be to preserve that. If anything, they're working against that, and what they're doing is driving some fans away. Now, look, we've been following the sport for some time. It would take a hell of a lot to stop us from watching Formula One, but I can totally understand why some fans may feel that they don't want to follow the sport anymore. They have no faith in the integrity of the sport, and integrity is a key factor here. I mean, when all this is said and done, the one thing that does concern me is how fans will feel about the integrity of the sport. It's taken a lot of hits in the last few years. This could be the one that potentially tips the boat over if it gets handled incorrectly. Lee, before we sign off, any final thoughts on what we've just discussed?
Well, on the leak, obviously this is nowhere in comparison to a world war, but I'm going to use the phrase that comes to my mind is, if you don't know your history, one of the slogans that was said in the UK was, I had it in my head now. I was saying about loose lips cost lives.
Yes.
That's it. Came back. And it could have just been a simple slip of we've got this being a bad day at work. Oh, why is that? Oh, it's just this Red Bull investigation. It could be a simple thing like a statement of someone talking to a husband or wife at home, or speaking to a colleague, and someone's overheard. It may not even been "Oi, mate, look, this is what's going on." It may not be anything like that at all. So it just, in a sport of, as I said, it's nothing like a world war, but loose lips cost lives. In this sense, it cost a lot of reputation to the sport, cost a lot of reputation to Red Bull at a time when it wasn't confirmed, and it's completely unnecessary, as you both mentioned. and I've obviously made it clear at the beginning that I think the FA are going to make a mess of this.
Yeah.
I've got no faith in the FA at the moment. And it's not a surprise that Liberty Media are so annoyed. You think back to Bernie and Mosley in the Naughty, and they were a formidable team because they were on the same page. They knew what they wanted from the governance and from the commercial aspect, and the teams had to live with it. Tough. This is the way it's going to be. And at the moment, that's not happening. It hasn't happened for a while. Obviously, the commercials want one thing. The governance, I don't think they actually know what they want.
I mean, could you imagine what Bernie would have said if this had all come out? He probably would have just looked at the other teams and said, well, clearly Red Bull wanted it more because they spent more money than everyone else, regardless of the cost cap.
Yeah. So it's a fundamental issue within the sport is the governments and the commercials aren't on the same page. And until that's rectified and they're actually singing from the same hymn sheet, it's going to be an issue we're going to have with the sport going forward because one's going to pull one way, one's going to pull the other, and it's not going to work out for the benefit of the sport.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. Obviously, just to let you guys know, obviously, we put out a poll on Instagram. Courtney kindly did that for us to ask you guys what you thought a fitting punishment would be for Red Bull owing to their minor spending breach. And of course, we have to put minor inverted commas because I find it, as I said, I find it crazy that something between $1.8 to $2 million is considered a minor amount of spending. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, but apparently that's what they consider it right now. But interestingly, 36% of you voted for deduction of driver/championship points. The same amount also voted for limitations on next year's spending and, of course, wind tunnel time as well. So we seem to be evenly split on those one. 9% on a session suspension, not necessarily the race one, and 19% on fine and reprimand. So interesting to get your thoughts on that one, but it seems that more of you are leaning towards either a deduction of championship points and limitations on wind tunnel time and spending in future seasons. But guys, I think that's enough on this discussion for now. I think we're going to wrap this one up and put it in the history books. But let us know your thoughts on this one, guys. Let us know how you feel this whole budget cap saga has been handled by the FIA, how you feel about what has been what breaches have been committed by Aston Martin and Red Bull. Of course, we don't know the nature of those and how you feel about that. Also, let us know what you think the fitting punishments would be for those offenders. But of course, if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're following us on your favorite podcasting platform, don't forget to leave us a review. If you leave us a 5-star review on Apple, iTunes, or on Spotify, please do let us know and we will give you a shout out in a future episode. But until then, guys, that's been enough from us. We will see you in the next episode where we will be previewing is it the US Grand Prix? I believe it is. It is, yeah. I was checking my calendar. I almost forgot there. We're previewing the US Grand Prix as F1 goes back to the Circuit of Americas. And of course, we may find out more information regarding the details of these breaches and perhaps maybe a punishment as well. We'll have to wait and see. But until then, guys, please stay safe. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care. Thanks for tuning in.
See you soon.
Goodbye.